In this lesson, we will be discussing comparing and contrasting genres, specifically with historical accounts and historical fiction. Now, a historical account is a factual explanation of information regarding something in the past, while a historical fiction is taking the information from a historical account and adding fictional elements to it to create a more interesting story. The purpose for historical fiction is solely to entertain, while also giving important information. So, just like, for example, the movie Titanic. Titanic is a story or a movie about a real life event, which is the sinking of the quote unquote unsinkable ship, the Titanic. However, there are fictional elements added to it. For example, there are fictional characters such as Jack and Rose who are added to the story to have basically to make it to a love story, to make this story more interesting. However, there are real parts to the story. For example, it is about a real life event that did happen, and some of the parts of the movie were very true. So, in this lesson, we're going to be comparing two different texts. One that is real, a historical account, and one that is using real events and people, but adding fictional elements to it. So it is going to be fictional. Okay, so parts of it will be made up. So let's continue our lesson. It says, have you ever seen a movie about an important part of history, such as the civil rights movement, that included fictional characters? This kind of movie is a work of historical fiction or a story set in the past that combines made up characters and events with historical figures and real events from a specific time and place. A historical account, on the other hand, is a factual explanation, description, or narrative from or about the past. All the people actually lived, the places existed, and the events in a historical account really occurred. It says, study the illustration below. Which details are based on reality and which are fictional? Well, in the illustration, I see someone who I recognize immediately, which is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who I know was a real person who actually existed during the civil rights movement. Now, I can see that there's another person who I don't recognize, and also I can see that she has dialogue, or at least she's thinking, which means that that's probably made up information. So, usually when it comes to historical fiction, all the dialogue is made up by the author. In this case, she says, I'm going to remember this moment forever. Now, while yes, there probably were people who met Martin Luther King Jr. and they felt that they cherished that moment. In this case, she is still a made-up individual for this picture. So it says the image above shows a real person, Martin Luther King Jr., standing next to a fictional character, a young woman who admires him. In a similar way, historical fiction uses real people and events and then alters some historical details to tell a made up story. So then it says, study the chart to consider how the author of historical fiction draws upon real facts to create a work of fiction. So it says how historical fiction uses history. So first, it is set in a real time period and place. So again, like the Titanic, set in a real time period and place, provides factual information. So the movie did provide factual information, especially with showing how the ship sank. Includes events that actually occurred. So it did include events that actually occurred. For example, in the movie, they actually showcased some of the individuals who were actually on the ship and who had passed away. Uses historical figures, language, and details such as famous people or typical customs of the time. So again, we did see typical language and details such as the way that people dressed and the way that they spoke from the times. And so therefore that's how the historical fiction was used in history. And in this case, our example we're discussing is Titanic. Now, how historical fiction alters history is that the plot combines real and made up events. So, of course, we have the real events of the Titanic sinking, but then we have the made up events of the love story that's all throughout the movie as well. Made up yet realistic characters interact with real people who once lived. So again, we had our characters Rose and Jack, who had their love story. And they, of course, there were some real characters who did appear on the Titanic movie as well. Most dialogue is invented. Almost all the dialogue in Titanic is invented because we don't know exactly what people said on the boat, and then may interpret or change historical details to create a better story. So sometimes an author can change or interpret historical details to create a better story. And it's really important for you to be able to identify when they're doing that because you can't take historical fiction for fact because the author does have the freedom to change what they want. Good readers understand that historical accounts use facts and information to inform readers about history, while historical fiction is meant to entertain readers with an engaging story that combines real and imagined characters and events from the past. As they read, good readers are aware of these differences and are careful to separate fact from fiction. Let's go to part two. So we're going to read a historical account first about the journey to the Pacific. And then we're going to put what we learned into a chart. And then afterwards, we're going to read a historical fiction about the same event. And then put what we've learned in the same chart. So, Journey to the Pacific. In 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the first U.S. expedition to the Pacific coast of North America. Sent by President Thomas Jefferson to chart a route through unexplored regions of the country, the team of explorers recorded the wide variety of plants, animals, and geography they saw in the wilderness. The expedition journeyed along rivers, over mountains, and through valleys for over a year, encountering hostile tribes, inclement weather, and challenging terrain. On November 7th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery thought they had finally found the Pacific Ocean, but they were mistaken. The wide expanse of open water turned out to be the estuary, or mouth, of the Columbia River. With the help of native guides and determined companions, however, the team finally succeeded. The expedition reached the Pacific Ocean on November 15th, 1805. A long, hard winter and return journey lay before them, but the first half of their mission had been accomplished. So it says explore how to answer this question. What characteristics of a historical account are present in this passage? So it says this historical account of Lewis and Clark's expedition includes many details about their journey, underlying examples of facts, people, and places that present historical information. So I'm going to go back to the text and I'm going to underline any sort of facts or important information about the event or the people that are related to this event. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my underline tool and I'm going to try to underline any facts. So right here I see a very important fact. We've got in 1804, Lewis and Clark led the first U.S. expedition to the Pacific coast. That is very important. I see that they were sent by President Thomas Jefferson at the time, and that let's see, they encountered hostile tribes, inclement weather, and challenging terrain. I also see that on November 7th, they refer to it as the Corps of Discovery, and they thought they found the Pacific, but they really found the Columbia River. So then they had the help of native guides and determined companions, and eventually they reached the Pacific Ocean on November 15th, 1805. So all of this I'm going to record now in my chart down here. So it says fill in the first column of the chart below with facts from the account after reading the fictional story on the next page. Add additional details in the second column of the chart. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say Lewis and Clark were sent by uh, Thomas Jefferson to explore the west of America. And I'm actually going to put a little bullet point here. And next, I saw that they started their journey in 1804 and thought they discovered the Pacific um, on November, I believe it was November 8th. I'm going to go back up and I'm going to double check. I'm sorry, November 7th. On November 7th, 1805. But it was the Columbia River. On November 15th, 1805, and I'm going to refer to their name because that was important information. So the Corps of Discovery um, reached the Pacific Ocean. So I have quite a few historical facts from the text that I just read. So now we're going to go on to the next text and we're going to read a historical fiction account and we're going to see what fictional we see and then add it to this chart. So let's move on. Sighting the Pacific. As the weary explorers reached the top of the hill, Mr. Lewis let out a cry of delight. "We've made it," he exclaimed, "the Pacific!" The men exchanged doubtful glances. Just last week, Mr. Clark had rejoiced along with the entire team, confident that the large body of water before them was the ocean. Later they discovered that the water was just the estuary of the Columbia River. Yet they smelled ocean air. Peter had tried to stay positive as they continued their search, but it was extremely difficult. Would today, November 15th, actually be the day they reached the Pacific Ocean? "That certainly is a sight for sore eyes," one of the men exclaimed, and Peter looked up and grinned. After a year and a half of traveling, they had in fact come upon the salt waters of the Pacific. So this is the end of part one. Go ahead and click on part two to see the rest of the lesson.